October 15th, 1943. The sun hung low over the Italian countryside, casting long shadows across the rocky hills near Monte Battaglia. In a makeshift observation post carved into the mountainside, Private First Class Tommy Kowalski squinted through what appeared to be a telescope made from spare rifle parts, broken field glasses, and wire salvaged from a destroyed radio. His sergeant stood behind him, arms crossed, shaking his head in disbelief. The other men in the unit had been calling it Kowalski's contraption for weeks. Some laughed outright when they saw it mounted on his Springfield. Others muttered about regulations and proper equipment. But none of them were laughing now because down in the valley, a German Panzer Mark IV was grinding its way toward the Allied supply line. And Tommy Kowalski was about to do something that would rewrite the book on precision shooting. Tommy wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be back at base camp, helping with supply runs and equipment maintenance. He wasn't trained as a sniper. He didn't have the official marksman badges or the fancy scopes that came from the armory. What he had was a mind that saw problems and refused to accept that they couldn't be solved. And the biggest problem facing his unit was simple. They couldn't see far enough, and they couldn't shoot accurately enough when it mattered most. The war in Italy had been grinding on for months. Allied forces had pushed inland from Sicily, but every mile gained came at a brutal cost. German forces had dug in across the mountainous terrain, turning every ridge, every valley, every stone farmhouse into a fortress. Standard infantry tactics weren't working. Artillery was limited by the terrain. Air support was often grounded by weather. What commanders needed were soldiers who could reach out and touch targets at distances that seemed impossible. They needed precision. They needed innovation. They needed someone willing to think outside the manual. Tommy Kowalski was born in the steel mills of Pittsburgh in 1921. His father worked the furnaces at Carnegie Steel, coming home every night covered in soot and sweat. His mother ran a small tailor shop from their cramped apartment, mending clothes and altering suits for neighbors who couldn't afford new ones. Tommy grew up with his hands in grease and his eyes on the details that others missed. By age 12, he could strip down a pocket watch, clean every gear, and put it back together running better than when he found it. By 16, he was building radio sets from scratch, selling them to local businesses for extra money his family desperately needed. When the war started, Tommy enlisted not because he was eager to fight, but because he understood machines. He understood precision. And he understood that wars were won by the side that could see problems clearly and solve them faster than the enemy. The Army assigned him to the 34th Infantry Division as a radio operator and general mechanic. His job was to keep communication equipment running in conditions that destroyed most electronics within days. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. And it taught him something crucial about warfare that most soldiers never learned. Victory didn't always go to the strongest or the bravest. It went to the most prepared, the most adaptable, and the most willing to improvise when everything else failed. The idea for the scope came to him during a particularly frustrating week in September. His unit had been pinned down by a German machine gun nest positioned on a ridge nearly 1,000 yards away. Too far for effective rifle fire with standard iron sights. Too close for artillery without risking friendly casualties. The official solution was to wait for specialized sniper teams or air support. But waiting meant watching German reinforcements arrive. Waiting meant giving up tactical advantage. Waiting meant more dead Americans. Tommy spent 3 nights studying the problem. He sketched angles and distances in a notebook by candlelight. He calculated bullet drop and wind compensation using mathematics he'd learned in high school shop class. He measured the limitations of standard rifle sights and compared them to the optics available in damaged field equipment scattered around their position. Broken binoculars, cracked periscopes from destroyed tanks, telescope lenses from artillery spotting scopes, pieces of precision equipment that the Army would normally write off as unusable. But Tommy saw something else. He saw components. Raw materials for something that didn't exist in any manual or supply catalog. A scope that could extend the effective range of a standard infantry rifle far beyond what anyone thought possible. Not because it was better than factory equipment, but because it was designed specifically for the conditions they were facing. Built from parts that understood the war they were actually fighting, not the war some engineer had imagined back in Detroit. The first prototype took him 4 days to assemble. He used lenses from a pair of damaged binoculars, mounting them in a housing made from a rifle cleaning rod and spare metal brackets. The adjustment mechanisms came from a broken artillery compass. The mounting system was fabricated from radio antenna parts and reinforced with wire from a destroyed field telephone. It looked like something a child might build in a garage. It violated probably a dozen Army regulations regarding equipment modification. And when he showed it to his squad leader, the man's first reaction was to laugh. That changed the morning Tommy took it to the firing range they'd improvised behind their position. Using ammunition he'd carefully selected and weighed, firing from a position he'd calculated for maximum stability, Tommy put 5 rounds into a target the size of a dinner plate at 600 yards. Then he moved the target back to 800 yards and did it again. By the time he was consistently hitting targets at 1,000 yards, word had spread through the entire company. The laughter stopped, but the skepticism didn't. Officers questioned whether the scope would hold up under combat conditions. Other soldiers wondered if it was just luck, or if Tommy had somehow discovered ammunition that was more accurate than standard issue. The supply sergeant worried about what would happen if everyone started modifying their equipment without permission. There were regulations for a reason, he said. Standards existed to maintain reliability across thousands of soldiers in dozens of different conditions. Tommy didn't argue with any of them. He just kept refining his design. He tested it in rain, in mud, in the kind of temperature extremes that turned standard equipment into expensive paperweights. He adjusted the mounting system to absorb recoil better. He waterproofed the lens housings using techniques he'd learned working on radios. He created adjustment procedures that could be performed in complete darkness using nothing but touch and muscle memory. And every modification made the scope more reliable, more accurate, and more suited to the specific demands of mountain warfare in Italy. But precision equipment means nothing without precision shooting. And precision shooting requires more than just good optics. It demands an understanding of ballistics that goes far beyond pointing a rifle in the general direction of the enemy. Tommy spent weeks studying how bullets behaved at extreme distances, how wind affected trajectory, how temperature and humidity changed the flight path of a projectile, how the rotation of the Earth itself could influence a shot at ranges over 800 yards. Most importantly, he learned patience. The kind of patience that comes from understanding that one perfectly placed shot could accomplish what 100 hasty shots could not. The patience to wait for the right conditions, the right target, the right moment when everything aligned. Because when you're shooting at distances where the target looks like a speck through even the best optics, there's no room for approximation. There's no such thing as close enough. The German Panzer in the valley below was about to test every hour Tommy had spent perfecting his craft. At 1,200 yards, it was further than he'd ever attempted a shot in combat, further than most military manuals considered effective for infantry weapons. But Tommy had stopped thinking about what manuals said was possible. He was thinking about physics, about mathematics, about the precise moment when theory would meet reality in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. The Panzer moved slowly through the valley, its commander apparently confident that no Allied forces could threaten it at such distance. German doctrine assumed that American infantry posed no significant threat beyond 400 yards. Their own snipers rarely engaged targets beyond 600. The tank crew had no reason to expect danger from the rocky outcropping where Tommy lay prone behind his improvised rifle. Tommy's breathing slowed. His heartbeat became a metronome counting down to the moment of truth. Through his homemade scope, the tank filled his field of vision like a steel whale navigating through autumn grass. He could see details that should have been invisible at such range, the way mud caked the drive wheels, the radio antenna swaying with each bump in the terrain, the hatch where the tank commander's head was barely visible above the turret rim. But seeing the target was only the beginning. At 1,200 yards, a bullet would take nearly 2 full seconds to reach its destination. In that time, the tank would travel almost 30 feet. Wind could push the projectile several inches off course. Gravity would pull it down by more than 8 feet from its initial trajectory. Temperature differences between the rifle barrel and the ambient air would affect muzzle velocity. Even the slight uphill angle of the shot would change the ballistics in ways most shooters never considered. Tommy had considered all of it. For weeks, he'd been plotting firing solutions in his notebook like an artillery officer calculating coordinates for a howitzer battery. He'd measured wind speed using techniques learned from watching his mother hang laundry on windy Pittsburgh afternoons. He'd estimated range using trigonometry and landmarks he'd studied through captured German maps. Every variable had been accounted for, every calculation double-checked. His finger found the trigger. Not the quick, jerky pull that most infantry used in firefights, but the slow, steady pressure that precision shooters learn through thousands of practice rounds. The kind of trigger control that treats each shot like a surgical procedure, rather than an act of violence. The Springfield barked once. The sound echoed off the surrounding hills like thunder rolling through a canyon. Tommy worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering another round, never taking his eye from the scope. Through the optics, he watched the tank continue its forward progress for what seemed like an eternity. Then the bullet found its mark. The impact was spectacular, not because the bullet penetrated the tank's armor, which would have been impossible for standard infantry ammunition, but because Tommy hadn't been aiming for the armor. He'd been aiming for the vision port where the driver peered through thick glass to navigate the terrain. The bullet shattered the port completely, sending fragments of glass and metal into the driver's compartment like shrapnel from a grenade. The Panzer lurched violently to the left, its driver blinded and panicking. The massive machine careened off the road and into a drainage ditch, where its tracks spun uselessly in the soft earth. Black smoke began pouring from the engine compartment as the crew scrambled to escape through the top hatches. Tommy watched through his scope as German soldiers emerged from the disabled tank, looking around frantically for the source of the impossible shot. They scanned the tree line at normal infantry ranges, never imagining that death had reached out to touch them from nearly 3/4 of a mile away. Behind him, Tommy heard his sergeant's voice, quiet with something between amazement and disbelief. "Jesus Christ, Kowalski, what did you just do?" But Tommy was already working the bolt again, chambering another round. Because one disabled tank was impressive, but it wasn't the end of the story. Through his scope, he could see German infantry dismounting from half-tracks behind the Panzer. Officers were shouting orders, trying to organize a response to an attack they couldn't locate or understand. Radio operators were calling for artillery support to suppress American positions they couldn't identify. The confusion was exactly what Tommy had hoped for. When an enemy can't determine where fire is coming from, they waste ammunition shooting at shadows. When they can't understand how they're being engaged, they make tactical decisions based on incomplete information. And when they're forced to react to threats they can't see, they stop thinking strategically and start thinking defensively. Tommy selected his next target carefully. Not another tank, but the radio antenna mounted on one of the half-tracks. Communication equipment was always a high-value target, but at this range, hitting something as thin as an antenna required precision that bordered on the miraculous. The shot would serve two purposes. First, it would further disrupt German coordination by cutting their communication links. Second, it would demonstrate to anyone watching that the first shot hadn't been luck. He adjusted his scope for the slightly different range and angle. The antenna swayed in the morning breeze like a fishing rod waiting for a bite. Tommy controlled his breathing, let his heart rate settle, and squeezed the trigger with the same methodical precision he'd used on pocket watches in his mother's tailor shop. The antenna disappeared in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Now the German soldiers weren't just confused. They were terrified. Enemy fire that could reach out and touch them with surgical precision from an unknown location violated everything they'd been taught about infantry combat. Their training told them that American riflemen were adequate but unexceptional. Their experience suggested that Allied marksmanship was competent but not extraordinary. Tommy Kowalski was rewriting their assumptions with every shot. The word spread through the German ranks like wildfire. Scharfschütze, sniper. But not just any sniper. This was something else entirely. Someone who could hit targets that shouldn't be hittable, from positions that shouldn't be possible, with equipment that shouldn't exist. Within minutes, German artillery observers were calling in strikes on every likely sniper position within a mile radius. Mortar rounds began falling on ridgelines and rocky outcroppings where a marksman might conceivably hide. Machine gun teams swept the tree line with suppressive fire, hoping to force the phantom shooter into the open. But Tommy wasn't where they expected him to be. His position had been chosen not just for its field of fire, but for its ability to withstand counter-battery fire. The rocky overhang that concealed him also protected him from all but direct hits. And the angles he'd calculated weren't just for shooting. They were for surviving the inevitable response. As German shells exploded around his position, Tommy continued working. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the calm efficiency of a craftsman completing a masterpiece. Each shot was deliberate. Each target was chosen for maximum psychological impact as well as tactical value. A fuel truck exploded in a fireball visible for miles. An officer fell while pointing toward imaginary threats. A machine gun position went silent when its gunner simply vanished behind his weapon. The German advance had stopped completely. What should have been a methodical movement toward Allied supply lines had become a desperate search for an enemy they couldn't find and couldn't fight. Officers huddled behind their vehicles, afraid to expose themselves. Radio chatter filled with reports of multiple snipers, phantom positions, and impossible shots. In reality, there was still just one man with a homemade scope, proving that innovation could overcome almost any disadvantage when combined with skill, patience, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations that others took for granted. For granted. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical destruction. German field commanders had trained for conventional engagements where threats could be identified, located, and neutralized through standard tactical responses. They understood how to deal with machine gun nests, mortar positions, even skilled snipers operating within normal parameters. But this was something entirely different. This was precision beyond their comprehension, delivered from ranges that challenged their fundamental understanding of infantry combat. Tommy chambered his 7th round of the engagement, his movement still smooth and deliberate despite the chaos erupting around the German position below. Through his scope, he could see officers gathered around a map spread across the hood of a staff car, frantically trying to coordinate a response to an attack they couldn't categorize. Their gestures were animated, desperate. They pointed in multiple directions, each convinced the fire was coming from a different location. That staff car represented something more valuable than armor or artillery. It was the nerve center of the German advance, the place where tactical decisions flowed from field observations to radio orders to coordinated action. Without effective command and control, even the most disciplined units would fragment into confused clusters of individual soldiers making individual decisions based on incomplete information. Tommy adjusted his scope one final time, accounting for the subtle wind shift he detected by watching dust patterns kicked up by the German vehicles. The range to the staff car was actually shorter than his previous shots, but the target he'd selected presented its own unique challenges. Not the officers themselves, but the radio equipment mounted in the vehicle's rear compartment. Specifically, the main transceiver antenna that connected this forward unit to German artillery positions several miles behind the lines. The shot required threading a needle at nearly 1,000 yards. The antenna was barely visible even through his enhanced optics, a thin metal rod that swayed with each gust of wind. Miss by inches and the bullet would sail harmlessly over the vehicle. Miss by fractions of inches and it might strike the radio housing without disabling the equipment completely. But hit it precisely at the base where the antenna connected to the transmitter, and the entire German communication network in this sector would go dark. Tommy had spent months perfecting shots like this. Not just the mechanical aspects of marksmanship, but the mental discipline required to attempt the impossible while artillery shells exploded close enough to shower him with rock fragments. The kind of focus that transformed external chaos into internal calm, that turned the screaming confusion of battle into a mathematical problem with a precise solution. He fired. The bullet's path traced an invisible arc across the valley, carrying with it weeks of calculation, months of preparation, and years of accumulated skill. For nearly 2 seconds, the projectile flew through space that seemed suspended between success and failure, between vindication and embarrassment, between tactical victory and costly mistake. The antenna disintegrated, not just broken, but completely destroyed in a shower of metal fragments that sparkled in the morning sunlight. The radio equipment sparked and went silent. The officers gathered around their map suddenly found themselves cut off from artillery support, air cover, and coordination with adjacent units. They were isolated in enemy territory with no way to call for help and no way to report their situation to higher command. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German soldiers who had been trained to rely on superior coordination and communication suddenly found themselves operating blind. Without radio contact, they couldn't call for the artillery strikes that might have suppressed Tommy's position. Without communication to adjacent units, they couldn't coordinate flanking maneuvers or tactical withdrawals. Without connection to higher command, they couldn't even report what they were facing or request instructions for dealing with this unprecedented threat. But Tommy wasn't finished. Through his scope, he could see German soldiers beginning to break cover, moving in small groups toward positions they thought might offer better protection. It was exactly the kind of movement he'd been waiting for. Soldiers in the open, exposed, making decisions based on panic rather than tactical thinking. His 8th shot dropped a sergeant who had been attempting to organize a withdrawal. The 9th disabled a machine gun team that was setting up to provide covering fire. The 10th struck a fuel container being carried by soldiers attempting to resupply their vehicles, creating another spectacular fireball that sent black smoke billowing across the entire German position. By now, the enemy formation had completely disintegrated. What had begun as an organized advance toward Allied supply lines had devolved into a scattered collection of terrified soldiers seeking individual shelter behind whatever cover they could find. Officers had lost control of their men. Non-commissioned officers were making independent decisions without coordination. The careful discipline that made German units so effective had crumbled under the psychological pressure of facing an enemy they couldn't locate, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight using conventional methods. Tommy paused his fire, not because he was out of targets, but because he wanted to observe the full scope of what he'd accomplished. Through his homemade scope, he watched German soldiers abandoning equipment, fleeing vehicles, retreating in small groups back down the valley road they'd advanced along with such confidence just an hour earlier. The Panzer that had seemed so threatening was now a smoking ruin blocking the path of retreat. Supply trucks burned like signal fires announcing German defeat to anyone within 10 miles. But the most important victory wasn't visible through any scope. It was the transformation taking place in the minds of German commanders throughout the sector. Radio reports from the surviving units would describe an engagement that challenged everything they thought they knew about American capabilities. Stories would spread about precision shooting that defied explanation, about equipment modifications that shouldn't have been possible, about individual soldiers who could single-handedly disrupt entire formations. Those stories would create hesitation. They would cause German officers to overestimate American capabilities and underestimate their own tactical advantages. They would lead to more cautious advances, more defensive positioning, more resources dedicated to counter-sniper operations that might never encounter the threats they were designed to neutralize. The psychological effect of Tommy's innovation would ripple through German tactical thinking for months to come. Behind him, Tommy heard footsteps approaching his position. His sergeant appeared, moving carefully to avoid silhouetting himself against the skyline, followed by several other soldiers from their unit. Their faces showed a mixture of amazement, respect, and something approaching awe. They had witnessed something that would become legend in their unit. A story told and retold until the details became larger than life. But Tommy was already thinking about improvements. The scope had performed flawlessly, but he'd noticed slight parallax issues at extreme ranges that could be corrected with better lens alignment. The mounting system had held steady throughout the engagement, but it could be reinforced to handle the heavier recoil of armor-piercing ammunition if such rounds became available. The entire assembly could be made more compact, more weatherproof, more adaptable to different rifle platforms. Because this engagement wasn't the end of innovation, it was proof of concept. It was demonstration that individual soldiers with sufficient skill and determination could overcome equipment limitations through intelligent improvisation. It was evidence that the Army's assumptions about effective engagement ranges and precision shooting capabilities needed to be completely reconsidered. Word of Tommy's achievement spread through Allied forces faster than official communications could carry it. Soldiers talked about the marksman with the homemade scope who had single-handedly stopped a German armored advance. Officers discussed the tactical implications of extended-range precision fire. Engineers began studying the possibility of manufacturing improved optical equipment based on field modifications that had proven successful under combat conditions. Within weeks, Tommy found himself pulled from regular infantry duties and assigned to a specialized unit tasked with developing improved sniper capabilities. His homemade scope was disassembled, studied, and analyzed by optical engineers who marveled at the ingenuity of its design. The techniques he developed for extreme-range shooting became the foundation for new training programs. The tactical concepts he'd proven in combat influenced doctrine that would shape military thinking for decades. But the real victory wasn't in the recognition or the assignments or the official validation of his innovation. It was in the knowledge that when everything conventional had failed, when standard equipment and standard tactics had proven inadequate, individual ingenuity and determination had found a way to succeed. Tommy had proved that limitations existed primarily in the mind, that innovation could overcome almost any disadvantage, and that one soldier with a clear vision and the skill to execute it could change the course of entire battles. The war in Italy continued for months after that October morning, but the psychological balance had shifted. German forces that had once advanced with confidence now moved with caution, always scanning distant ridgelines for threats they couldn't see but knew might be there. Allied soldiers approached their own equipment limitations with new creativity, understanding that regulations and standard procedures were starting points rather than absolute boundaries. The ripple effects of that single engagement traveled far beyond the Italian mountains. In Allied command posts scattered across the Mediterranean theater, intelligence officers compiled reports that painted an increasingly clear picture. German formations were exhibiting new patterns of caution. Advance elements that had previously moved with mechanical precision now proceeded in fits and starts, constantly scanning terrain features that had never concerned them before. Radio intercepts revealed growing anxiety about American sniper capabilities that seemed to exceed anything in their intelligence files. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the workshops and armories where Allied soldiers gathered around Tommy's modified rifle like pilgrims studying a religious artifact. The scope that had been dismissed as a crude contraption just weeks earlier was now being measured, sketched, and analyzed by anyone with technical knowledge. Soldiers who had never given a second thought to the limitations of their equipment suddenly found themselves questioning everything they'd been told about what was possible. Sergeant Mike DeLuca from Boston spent 3 days studying the mounting mechanism, trying to understand how Tommy had achieved such stability with salvaged parts. Corporal James Wright from Tennessee attempted to replicate the lens alignment using components from a damaged periscope. Private Danny Romano from Chicago began collecting broken optical equipment with the fervor of a prospector gathering precious metals. Each man brought his own background, his own skills, his own unique perspective to the problem of extending human capability beyond its apparent limits. The conversations that emerged from these informal engineering sessions revealed something profound about the nature of innovation under pressure. These weren't trained scientists or professional engineers. They were farmers and factory workers, mechanics and shop clerks, men who had learned to solve problems through necessity rather than theory. But when confronted with clear evidence that the impossible was actually achievable, they approached the challenge with a combination of practical knowledge and desperate creativity that formal education couldn't match. Tommy found himself at the center of these discussions, not as a teacher but as a fellow experimenter. He shared his techniques freely, explaining the mathematics behind ballistic calculations and the physics of optical magnification with the same enthusiasm he'd once shown for radio circuits and clockwork mechanisms. But more importantly, he encouraged others to push beyond his achievements, to see his scope not as a finished solution, but as proof that much greater innovations were possible. The Army's official response was predictably complex. On one hand, regulations existed for important reasons. Standardized equipment ensured reliability across thousands of soldiers in dozens of different environments. Unauthorized modifications could create liability issues, training complications, and supply chain problems that affected entire divisions. Field commanders couldn't simply ignore protocols that had been developed through years of hard-won experience. On the other hand, Tommy's results spoke for themselves. A single soldier with improvised equipment had accomplished what entire units with standard gear had failed to achieve. The tactical implications were enormous, but so were the questions about how such innovations could be scaled, controlled, and integrated into existing military doctrine. Major Harrison Wells, a West Point graduate with engineering background, was assigned to investigate the phenomenon and develop recommendations for higher command. Wells arrived at Tommy's position expecting to find either exaggerated reports or dangerous improvisation that had succeeded through luck rather than skill. Instead, he discovered something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the relationship between official procurement and battlefield effectiveness. Wells spent hours examining Tommy's scope, testing its performance, and documenting its construction techniques. He interviewed soldiers who had witnessed the engagement, verified the range calculations, and studied the tactical situation from multiple perspectives. His preliminary report, filed just 2 weeks after his arrival, contained a single sentence that would influence military thinking for decades to come. Private Kowalski has demonstrated that individual innovation, when properly applied, can achieve results that exceed the capabilities of standard equipment by orders of magnitude. But Wells also recognized that Tommy's achievement raised uncomfortable questions about the Army's procurement and training systems. If a self-taught soldier using salvaged parts could outperform expensive factory-built equipment, what did that say about the contractors who supplied standard scopes? If individual modifications could provide such dramatic tactical advantages, why weren't soldiers being encouraged to experiment rather than discouraged from deviating from regulations? Tommy Kowalski returned to Pittsburgh after the war, never seeking recognition for that October morning in Italy. He opened a small optical repair shop, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 3 children who grew up hearing bedtime stories about precision, patience, and the power of seeing problems differently. He never spoke of heroism or glory, just the quiet satisfaction that comes from refusing to accept that something can't be done. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't following the manual. Sometimes it's proving that innovation, determination, and a willingness to think beyond conventional limits can change everything. One homemade scope, one impossible shot, one soldier who dared to build what others said couldn't exist.